standardization. The first one was in March. Project. I have a quite nice set of speakers. Just for your information, the webinar will be recorded. Yeah, why again this webinar? I think the objective is to continue to explore the opportunities, but also maybe the challenges in integrating the open source and standardization world, also to get a little bit known which best practices are out there in maybe the different institutions and also maybe in the different technology contexts, and also what is maybe a little bit a game changer, because I just checked my slides from last year, and I compared this with what we have found a few years ago together with Mirko Böhm, who was also in the core from the Linux Foundation. Then I first said there's not much change, but I see now some changes, that the two worlds are getting closer, but still there might be some issues which might be addressed in order to really make the collaboration, the integration more effective, and therefore we again try to bring together also
Hi, this is Astor from Open Forum Europe. Can you hear me? Just to do a sound check. Okay,
yes.
Good. Then
Yes, we will.
maybe then, while we're waiting for Knut to maybe disconnect, maybe I'll be able to.
now you.
You're back, Knut. I didn't hear you for a bit. Knut, you take over again.
Okay, I wasn't heard. Okay.
No, for maybe the last minute or so, minute and a half.
Yeah, I went through the agenda, but I give you the floor now, and we will go then through the agenda then and introduce everybody. Also, floor is yours.
Okay, sure. Let me see if I can do this quite quickly. But so I have been asked to present as the European Open Source Academy, which again, I should say, I don't speak for the European Open Source Academy. I'm not a member, and I'm very much not the president, but I'm part of the project that organizes and the launch of this institution. Can you all see my slides, by the way? Can I maybe comment in the chat? Okay, yes. Very good. Very good. I'm glad. So yeah, the European Open Source Academy follows in the now very long tradition of the arts and science academies of Europe. Think of the Académie des Sciences in Paris, Royal Society, or I'm Swedish, so I'll of course have to mention the Swedish Academy. And here, the basis of this as the form to organize an effort around increasing the public recognition of open source is linked to the fact that there are elements of open source that are both art and science. And so, and of course, one of the big public efforts of the European Open Source Academy is the European Open Source Awards ceremony and the European Open Source Prize. So yeah, part of its goal, which is to well, not only recognize excellence in open source, but also increasing the public recognition of open source in Europe. And so what's very exciting for us who were, initiated this effort was the interest from some great open source representatives in Europe to join this effort. For those who come from the world of open source, I think you will recognize many of these names here, and the excellent group of people that are coming together. It's an interesting element, and this comes from the research into why people volunteer to work on open source. A big part of it is peer recognition, and we believe that the best way of creating a powerful and influential open source award that really celebrates European excellence in open source would be to have the peers give the award themselves, as opposed to, for example, the European Commission itself. So the Commission has lent some of its, borrows legitimacy from them and lends its legitimacy to this group in order to celebrate open source excellence in Europe. And so, here are some of the members. So why are we then working together with the StandICT project and organizing this webinar? Well, a big part, what the Academy wants to do is to support and create these platforms for learning. The relationship between the European standardization system, discussions around open standards and open source now, like Knut said, it's becoming very practical question where it's been a bit more theoretical in the past, to simplify greatly. But we hope, and working with the Academy, that we can create more platforms for these kinds of exchanges. And of course, and I suspect other speakers will get into this, and I participate in a panel later, so I won't get into too many details, but it's important, we think, to recognize the standardizing force or the of open source, and also understanding as open source methodologies as a complement, maybe something that the more traditional standardization ecosystems can learn from, as the demands on, for example, new harmonized standards for regulation is really drastically increased, especially with horizontal regulations that touch on software in different ways. So we really hope that we can continue to create conversations like this. And if you're in Brussels during the EU Open Source Week at the end of January, sign up and see if you might get a ticket to the award ceremony. It should be very nice. But now I'll hand it over to the other participants and speakers. I'm going to try to get rid.
Yeah, thank you, Astor, for giving us an insight into the EU Academy and general role of open source. And now I hand over to Jory Burson from the Linux Foundation, right? To give first the open source kind of communities say.
Hi, Knut. Thanks so much for having me. So my name is Jory Burson. I'm the Vice President of Standards for the Linux Foundation, and I run a part of our organization called the Joint Development Foundation, which is approximately 40 projects at this point that exist in a very interesting space. We consider a lot of these activities that we do under the Joint Development Foundation, pre-standardization. These are often collaborations with open source and standards professionals, and I'm excited to tell you a little bit about them. We exist in a space that I think of as the in-between layer. And so I kind of titled this presentation, Lost and Found in Translation, Open Source and Open Standards, Lessons from the Front Line. I'm going to give probably 3 challenges and lessons learned, and share those slides with Anya to distribute to you all after the presentation. So one thing that we are lucky enough to do in our role at the Linux Foundation is help serve as that translation layer between different groups of people. I think no one here would run afoul of trying to paint all of open source or all of standardization activities with a really broad brush. These are not all uniform communities. And so there's a little bit of what you might think of as cultural or subcultural variation between these groups. And those differences can really, really matter. So again, wanted to talk about a couple of things that we have learned that have helped make a big difference when we are working and walking in both spaces. The first thing that we have learned, and I think this webinar here is a great example of this in practice, is that open source and standards organizations really do want to work together. I think for a while, and especially like when I first started in my career, these two places felt like, oil and water, and never the two shall meet. And that is definitely not the vibe that I get today. The momentum that we have in many of our communities between different groups wanting to just liaise with each other, learn from each other, or collaborate with each other is just extraordinary. The challenge, however, is that a lot of times what I think of as our terms of art aren't shared, and language is imprecise, right? So that can lead to some confusion and distrust among groups. Even words like open, words like contributor, words like member, open source, standard, these have some nuance to them. When you talk to an open source person, sometimes they may enthusiastically share with you that they're writing a standard. Well, no, they're probably collaborating on something that will maybe help with interoperability, but that itself is not a standard. And so there's sometimes interpretation and meaning that is not fully shared, and that can lead to discredit or lead to sort of an unwillingness to work. So these terms and definitions, though, that we use, being very important, they're going to have some nuance, and those again, terms aren't always shared, and we have to work with folks on kind of understanding what the multiple interpretations or meanings might be, and how to kind of take them into consideration. So a lesson here is to avoid, where we can, being overly pedantic or overly policing, overly tone policing different general terms, and instead focusing on, when we're working together, what are the shared outcomes that we are aiming to achieve together, or what are we trying to enable together, and just acknowledging that these terms often can exist on a spectrum, that we can help other people understand what we mean when we say, X, Y, or Z, and then help people orient where we are and understand where they're coming from, so we can say, okay, well, when we're saying this, we mean, and kind of go gentle. So lesson one, just focus on that shared outcome and avoid being, too exclusionary on the basis of using the wrong definition. A second lesson and thing that really helps us when we're collaborating together is to really lean on our shared membership. That shared membership is a very powerful tool. Oftentimes when we see organizations that are investing in a standards project, they may also be investing in, and often are investing in, open source tools, plugins, that sort of stuff around it. And that can be super, super helpful. The problem can be, however, while we think of, a company can be a member of a standards developing organization or consortia, we don't necessarily think of that company as a member of an open source project, because many open source projects are really focused on, individuals, maybe individuals from those companies, making open source contributions to repositories. So an open source project may not always have an agent the way that, that a standard does, right? Where again, a company can be a member of a standards organization. They may not be able to call themselves a capital M member of an open source project. So when you look at things like liaison agreements that we often want to facilitate between projects, it can be hard to find somebody who can represent the open source project as a member company. And open source projects can't typically and don't usually have policies like NDAs, for example, which again, in a traditional liaison agreement, your liaison is expected to abide by confidentiality policies. And so this can kind of create some friction. So what we have definitely encouraged our projects to lean on and encouraged more of our SDO partner friends to make publicly accessible deliverables so that reduces the friction that we might have between finding and sourcing people who can formally represent or be an agent to the open source project to the standards group, so that there can be some more free flow of information between these groups. For an open source project, again, most of their deliverables are already openly licensed and available, so we don't necessarily need to sign anything for a standards organization to have access to that collateral, but it's sometimes the other way that can get tricky. Ultimately, what we find is where there's a strong will to collaborate, there's a way, and this is one of the techniques that we advocate for to overcome sometimes terms and policy problems. And then the last lesson, and then I'll hand it back over, is one of licensing. What we find is that most open source developer communities aren't really familiar with the kind of licensing regimes that standards organizations and consortia have. General licensing knowledge, I will say, perhaps not surprisingly, not shockingly, is kind of low among participants. Was at an event a few weeks ago, and I asked the question, within the community, do you think a lot of people understand your licensing structure? And the person just laughed and was like, absolutely not. So there's still some knowledge gap between the communities in terms of understanding how the way an open source license works. And then, conversely, for open source developers participating in standards activities, the way the standards IP licensing works. And so that's a tricky thing to overcome. There's obviously lots of material out there that help people understand these policies, but from our perspective, one of the things that we do in addition to sourcing this material is helping connect the community members to the deliverable development process itself, and connecting that process with the licensing requirements, and that helps them kind of educate themselves and connect, what they're doing with the requirements of the license, and makes it a little bit more of a practical learning than a theoretical kind of, well, that sounds like my legal department's problem kind of risk. So those are my 3 lessons. We want to work together. I can see it. We have a lot of shared membership, which is super powerful. And frankly, the licensing regimes are getting easier to assess and understand. We just need to work on, optimistically, we need to work on educating our communities and showing them the patterns and to do so successfully. And I will hand it back to Knut. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jory, for your insights and your recommendations, which we might also discuss later in the panel. And now we have Tobie with us, who will share his experiences from another open source community in his position, but he will kind of declare what he's going now to talk about, what organization he's going to represent. I give the floor to you.
Thank you very Thank you very much, Knut. I'm going to, first of all, I'll quickly introduce myself, but before I even do that, I'm going to second everything that Jory was just talking about before. So my name is Tobie Langel. I run a small consulting firm called Unlock Open, where we focus essentially on open source, open standards, and governance and policy. And so I also, I'm fairly involved with different open source projects and foundations. I'm board director at OpenJS, the JavaScript Foundation. I've been involved with OASIS, W3C as a standard organization, and ECMA for a very long time. And I've been quite involved recently through the Eclipse Foundation with both the CRA expert group of the EU Commission and Working Group 9 of StandICT. So I also now have quite a bit of experience, well, some recent experience in being involved in formal European standard organizations. And so essentially I was asked to sort of discuss the perspective of how can we bring the open source community to be more involved in the standardization process. And I will say that, you know, to sort of like second some of what Jory was talking about, there's a long history of convergence between the standards world and the open source world, right? And if you look at both, they both have strength. Strength is, and they can learn from each other. In particular, I feel like the open source world has mastered working in the open and being quite effective at gathering input from multiple stakeholders and creating artifacts that can be used across the industry and the different communities in a very meaningful way. So from a working mode perspective, I believe there's a lot that the standards world can learn from the practices that the open source communities have developed. And on the other hand, there is a lot to learn for open source communities in the governance practices and the structure that underpins standard organizations. And so, I feel like we're seeing a lot of this convergence happening, and there is a number of organizations that are, in my mind, an example of this middle ground, quite successful at delivering standards or specifications. And I'm thinking about, for example, W3C, OITF, or ECMA International, for example, which really kind of like sit at the convergence of these two worlds. So I think from that perspective, there's quite some hope and some very successful examples of delivering on that convergence. In my role in the standard organization, the European standard organizations, and in the participation in those process, I have found that it was difficult for open source contributors and the open source community to participate for a number of reasons. And I think sort of like outlining those are useful. First of all, the European standard organizations tend to be very synchronous in their procedures. They rely very much on meetings. And that's quite challenging for open source communities, which are in general spread across the world. And so what might be a good time for a meeting from a perspective of, say, an organization built in Europe might be the middle of the night somewhere else. I've found that in general, relying on more asynchronous structures for getting contribution makes that easier. So that's an example where I think there's some useful things to learn from the open source way of working, and that can make it easier for a broader community to participate. In general, in open source, it is fairly straightforward and easy for anyone to make a comment or to propose a contribution to an open source project, regardless of whether they're employer or of whatever country they're based in. And that makes it really easy to get expert input on very specific topic. As an example, the Eclipse Foundation, the Open Regulatory Compliance Working Group of the Eclipse Foundation, operates using open source models to write specifications. And fairly recently, we were looking at vulnerability, like management of vulnerabilities in projects. And in a discussion, I pointed out to someone who was completely not involved in that process, a specific thing that we're discussing, a specific topic, and they had some really important input on that topic, on how a part of the direction we were going in was not compatible with a fairly large open source project. And so because of the nature of the process, open and available to anyone, they were able to comment on the specification that we're authoring and immediately get their expert point across. And that's an example of the kind of nimbleness and agility that open source working modes provide, and I believe would be beneficial for standard organizations to consider. And so essentially, looking at how to help bring the open source community and have it more involved in standardization processes, I think the key really is to consider that this community is less organized and more distributed across jurisdictions than the traditional stakeholders that you find in standard setting organizations, and that the best strategies to get a lot of very renowned technical experts who are involved in those technologies and the open source communities to be involved in the open source standards is to essentially make it easier and more seamless to contribute to those standards and to be able to leverage their input. So really, if I would have any recommendation to make, it would be along those lines. Essentially, make it easier for a broader set of participation to the standards that are being written by organizations. And we have seen that this works very well in organizations like ECMO, W3C, or ATF. So it feels like swinging the pendulum a bit closer to openness would really help those open source communities to get involved. So, with this, and looking forward to discussing more of this in the panel a bit later, I'm going to give the floor back to you, Knut. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tobie, for sharing your experiences, in particular collected during your involvement in the Eclipse Foundation. Before we move to the standards, guys, some of them are not yet here. I'm happy that Carlos Lopez is with us from DG Connect, who will kind of present the perspective of the European Commission's view of the role of open source in the whole European standardization system. Carlos, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Knut. Can you confirm that you can hear me well?
Yes, we hear you well.
Excellent. Thank you very much for... Yes? Okay. Thank you so much for inviting me to this interesting webinar. So, as Knut introduced me, I'm Carlos Lopez. I'm a policy officer working on DG Connect at coordination standardization. So not really focusing on any topic in particular, but seeing things from a more high-level perspective and try to connect the different dots and identify common challenges. So maybe we can go to the next slide for my presentation. So I presented a bit, as the title said, a bit what is the situation, how we see the open source in the European standardization system, and also how we see the open source community. So as you see there, Europe is quite strong in open source. So you see there this graph where the EU outweighs or surpasses other jurisdictions on public code contribution to GitHub, for example. We also have in Europe, in Brussels, this FOSDEM conference, which is very, very good and brings together very experts on this open source software. And yes, we see open source as a common good, and of course, open source contributions create natural interoperability, and are well aligned with these digital rights and principles, and trying to contribute to the broader goals of competitiveness and tech sovereignty. So one of these examples is the next generation internet. I will go a little bit later to this into more detail, but we see that there is a vibrant community of open source contributors in the EU, which is something to have in mind when we are talking about this interplay between open source and standardization. So if we go to the next slide, I want to refer to this study, which has very useful recommendations on how to improve the relationship between open source software and standardization. So the study is from a few years ago, but I think many of the recommendations are still valid as of today. So I had a look at it just before this webinar, and for instance, it recommends a closer cooperation between the standardization and the open source communities. I'm glad to hear in previous speakers that the vibe is changing, and this is coming closer and closer. But still, I think I will present later. I think there are still some challenges, and this cooperation can be more fluid, because yeah, this will help, as I will say later, in many of our goals. One of them is possibly to improve the speed of the processes and the agility of the standard development process. Another recommendation was about the IPR policies in the SDOs, which was also mentioned by previous speakers. So you see, even though the study has a few years, there are some challenges that are still there. Of course, from the open source community, some of the recommendations are to really engage in standardization. So now we are seeing it with the CRA. There is a higher engagement of the open source community in the EOSAs particularly, but also in other SDOs. So I think this is something that needs to be promoted more and more, and try to find the best ways where the open source community can contribute in the already established multi-stakeholder framework of standardization, respecting WTO principle, respecting the rules of the game, basically, of standardization. So, yeah, maybe on this, yeah, you see that there are success stories, but there are still rare, and yeah, maybe we can move to the next slide. So as I said, one of the best practices that we have identified for this cooperation between open source and standardization is the next generation internet. So this is a funding program that has been operational since 2019. So every year there are new projects coming into the scene, and the idea there is to build the building blocks of a future internet stack, and based on inter alia open source solutions. And you see there's some statistics. So the projects are encouraged through the open calls or through the calls to first look into standardization as a state of the art to develop new solutions. And secondly, the research projects are encouraged to participate directly or to bring their technical contributions to standardization. So you see there that almost half or more than half of the projects funded through the Next Generation Initiative, Internet Initiative, are actively collaborating with SDOs, and notably, naturally, is the SDOs that are working on internet protocols or on the internet standardization like IETF or W3C, but also we see others like ETSI, IEEE, or OASIS, or ISO. So maybe please go to the next slide. Yes, here we go a little bit on the standards in support of digital regulation. So as you know, we have the CRA. The CRA partially regulates software and also open source software. So some parts of software that is treating open source is regulated with the CRA, and therefore there is a strong encouragement that the open source community shall contribute to the development of the harmonized standards. And as you see there in the standardization request, there are very specific language that, when relevant, the ESOs have to consider or facilitate the participation of relevant stakeholders, including the open source community when relevant. And this is the CRA, is very clear for the Cyber Resilience Act, but indeed, software is being more and more regulated in Europe, and of course, let's say contributions from the open source community are also very relevant for other pieces of legislation like the AI Act, the Data Act, or the Electronic Identity, or the EIDAS. So in the next slide, I will show a little bit initiatives or some examples of this into the European standardization system. So maybe to go a step forward or a bit higher level, you know that there is an ongoing revision of the European standardization system, which is governed by Regulation 1025, 2012. And there, some of the problems identified. So first, well, there is an open public consultation, which I encourage you all to have a look and to contribute if you are interested. So I think this 12 weeks from last week. So it was launched last week. Maybe I can put the link to the consultation later on in the chat. And then the problems that we identified are let's say, one is the speed and responsiveness to innovation of the European standardization system. Also, the inclusiveness. The European standardization system is very inclusive, but there are still some barriers of participation for certain actors like the SMEs, civil society, or academia, or the open source community. Another of the problems identified is the access to content that is legally relevant, so that is part of EU law. Certain parts of harmonized standards that are, let's say, referenced in the official journal have to be, let's say, after the court ruling, which many of you are possibly aware, have to be made publicly available. And the fourth problem is the global position of the EU standardization. So this, of course, contributes is linked to the bigger political goals of EU competitiveness and technological sovereignty. So standards are, of course, very important for the competitiveness of European businesses, and also very important to have to deploy EU-led solutions internationally. So some of the activities that you see there in the ESOs from ETSI and CENELEC. So from the ETSI side, ETSI is actively encouraging their members, because it's an organization with almost 1,000 members and benefits from this direct participation model to have direct contributions into the system. So open source associations that are members of ETSI, they can contribute directly to the standard development process. They don't have any bottlenecks to do that. And of course, also attract companies that are already contributing to open source projects. One speaker before mentioned that there are many companies that are members of the standard organizations and open source communities at the same time. So try to attract these members to contribute to this standard development and in ETSI. So attract new members or new players. So some organizations that might not be yet members of ETSI, try to attract them and explain how they can contribute directly to ETSI work. And they have let's say some groups, technical bodies that is called software development groups, and that basically they are very linked to the technical committee, so they can implement standards that are developing in ETSI technical committees in make software implementations and including open source software implementation of these standards, and also bring their open source or software solutions into these groups, and they can feed directly or give feedback to the ongoing standard development process in ETSI. So these links between technical committees and software development groups is something that is starting to take a lot of relevance in ETSI in some areas, which I think is very good. So this is on ETSI side. On the StandICT side, there are good liaisons with some open source organizations like the Eclipse Foundation. So they are actively contributing to the work of some JTCs or technical committees like in cybersecurity or in data, cloud, etc. So they are facilitating the participation of the open source community in different areas. Of course, this is, in my understanding, is that this is still at an ad hoc basis. So there is a formal liaison procedure that has to be pursued. And there is another aspect that StandICT can adopt international standards from ISO and IC. And ISO and IC have a mechanism that is called the Publicly Available Standards Process, or PAS. Many organizations active in open source are very well aware of that and are PAS submitters. So they can make their technical contributions or in their organizations, and they can send them to ISO and request that this technical contribution is transformed or adopted as an international standard. There are several examples of that. And then, of course, when this is done at international levels, StandICT can transpose into the European level this international standards. So these are, maybe there are more, it's a non-exhaustive list, but there are some examples of how the European standard organizations and the open source community are collaborating and finding synergies. And now I go to the next slide, which I think is the last one. So we also have an expert group under DG Connect management, let's say, which is the multi-stakeholder platform on ICT standardization, or MSP for short. So there in previous meetings, we had a recurrent agenda item on software standardization in Europe, including open source, where we had very interesting contributions from many players. So for example, DG Connect, we presented a bit the Generation Internet Initiative. In the Netherlands, they presented their strategy of digital autonomy for European governments through digital comms. So they showcase an example together with France and Germany of Membigo, which is a joint initiative for a collaboration software that is fully reusable and adaptable to ensure that we have that the public sector in Europe has technology sovereignty solutions and alternatives to big tech. And they inform, of course, about the creation of a European Digital Infrastructure Consortium, or EDIC, on digital commons. The idea there is also to contribute to the EU digital autonomy for European governments. Then ETSI presented a bit the initiatives that I was mentioning in the previous slide. Oasis, they mentioned that we can use the CRA as an opportunity to bring this cooperation between open source and the EOSA at a bigger scale and with more impact. For example, by leveraging existing open standards that are royalty free, and to bring those into the European standardization system. Like it happened in some examples in the past. I think some e-commerce solutions on e-invoicing were developed in that way. Linux Foundation Europe also started the debate of, let's say, how to have opportunities or identify opportunities for the adoption of open standards or open source implementations that can contribute to the EU policy goals and try to bring them in an easier way to the European standardization system. So they explained one case on open charging electric vehicle infrastructure, where basically, very shortly explained, there is an organization that developed the open standards, then makes the submission into the with a pass process or a fast track into the international level in ISO and IC, and then this international standard is adopted or transposed at the European level. So so there were some good discussions there how we can foster more these direct links between the European standard organizations and the organizations that develop open standards or open source specifications. Then Open Forum Europe, of course, they specify some issues that there are regarding IT standardization in Europe, and they put some proposal on which are the elements that they need to exist to make a more efficient IT standardization environment in Europe. So these include direct participation, free availability of standards, links to the international level, etc., collaboration with these foreign consortia. So basically, there was a very good discussions. Happy to give more information if you are interested. Then, of course, we have the rolling plan, which is a very broad but also very rich catalog of activities, not only in the European standard organizations, but also in the international standardization community, and also including open source organizations of standards and technical specifications that can support EU policies in the digital domain. So at the end, the conclusion from these discussions in the MSP was to have a working group and have some recommendations to the Commission on this topic, namely to create a more favorable for IT or software standardization in Europe. So this we will have some discussions in the upcoming MSP meeting, and hopefully this working group will be set up after that, and then we can contribute to this ongoing discussions and also feed to the revision of the standardization regulation. So in general, maybe next slide is the last one, is just the final slide. So from our side, we invite both the open source and the SDOs, particularly the DSOs, to keep working together on this topic, because we think that by the open source and standardization community working together, we can make the European standardization system more agile, more open, but also more impactful for contributing to the broader policy goals of competitiveness, tech sovereignty, and promoting of EU digital norms and standards internationally. So I'm stopping here and giving back the floor to Knut. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Carlos. I think you also a little bit saved the issue that our representative from StandICT on the one hand and Etsy didn't show up yet, but you already gave a little bit an insight how both organizations try to improve the interface between open source and standardization further and integrate especially open source content. However, we have to move on, and our next speaker is Francesco Giarini from the High Value Target. But maybe, Francesco, you introduce yourself a little bit in more details. Francesco?
Hello, hi everyone. Do you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, cool. Let me just connect as well my webcam. Okay, I hope you see me as well.
We see.
Cool.
Yours.
So look, what I have is I don't have any slides. Very good presentation from the previous speaker. Rather, I would like to just present myself and then have a couple of considerations for anything that is open source. So I lead a global community of cyber resilience professionals at issa.org. Anyone, by the way, is welcome to join. And I'm as well the founder of a education platform. It's called cyberresilienceacademy.com. You can as well take a look. Overall, what I see is that open source really provides a lot of opportunities, as we all know. I'm rather concerned of how critical we consider anything that is open source. So from cyber resilience is the ability to anticipate, withstand, recover, and evolve our organizations, right? And we know that we have, thousands of applications, each company more or less of medium, big size, and it's not always easy to inventorize everything. From a open source standpoint, what I can say, I see, well, one thing that we need to be aware of, and that's my main pitch for today, which is, are we sure that we are introducing software that will not be less secure than the rest of the components in a given platform or application, right? Log4j was a great example. We got as well SolarWinds with the Sunburst vulnerability, which had a number of open source building tools. There was then the 2024 UX utils backdoor, which was, pretty popular on Linux. And so, and there's as well a consideration, which is how many of the companies we work at use something like 7-zip, like it's open source GPL, and yet we don't really speak too much about how this software can be really secured in a way that it will not cause systemic impact if compromised. So again, Log4j is a great example. So my first key point is, number one, we need to find a way, a mechanism that while we develop open source software, there needs to be some way to ensure that if this is software that is highly distributed in most companies, that is properly assessed for criticality and then additionally secured with enhanced requirements that need to apply to critical software. So I enter now in the second point, which is, so open software can be critical software. There's actually a definition of critical software, which is very good from the United States NIST. I don't know if we have in Europe this similar methodology to assess critical software, but what I can say is that, again, if you think about creating software or even updating open source, if we have something that has higher privileges, direct access to networking or computing resources, and then even access to operational technology or other safety mechanisms, well, then that should be classified as critical software. That is open source, but then we need to protect this as critical software. So I wonder if in this space we have enough standards to secure this type of software. The CRA Act in Europe for sure goes into that direction, and then it's it's a first good step, but just the first one of a series of many others, I believe. And then there is the third point I'd like to make, which is related to safeguarding our collective cyber resilience, which is something that every cyber resilience officer needs to be doing. So again, there are great guidelines that are then used across the globe by various regulators, which are about setting up the right principles. I'm putting in a couple of links that you want to take a look at. guidelines for actually setting up the right principles for engineering trustworthy secure systems. And here there is one I would like to to bring your attention to, which is very relevant for cyber resilience. And it is about the interoperability of software, right? So overall, during an outage, during a cyber crisis, you want to have principles to design systems that allow you not to rely on proprietary platforms, and instead you need to maybe rebuild the organization from scratch. So for this, using interoperable system software, and of course open source is a great example, then this makes you more resilient, because then you are more adaptable, right? You can recover better because you have more options. And this is something that currently I don't think it's on the agenda of many officers out there or CISOs. And so I pasted here the publication, plus I zoomed into the interoperability property, because we need to start delivering architecture that accounts for this interoperability. These are the 3 key points I would like to make. I know it's a bit of a cyber and resilience kind of view on this, but I hope it resonates with some of you at least. And then, of course, you got there my contact at High Value Target, so feel free to reach out. Any question from you, Knut? Does it make sense?
Yeah, thank you. We will come back to this to your contributions later.
Okay.
So far, we have now all the inputs from the different speakers, and before we enter the panel discussion, everybody is invited to come up with questions, and we have from the chat 2 questions from Angel Martin or Martin Angel, and there are two aspects he raised. The first one is maybe addressing the open source community, whether they could remove barriers to non-public standards, and I assume that non-public means that standards which are linked to different IPRs, in particular patents. And are the open source communities have a solution for that? Tobie, you raised the hand.
So I'm happy to try to address part of that question. Open source by itself cannot solve the problem of patents on existing technology, right? And so while there might be other open source solutions that are not reading on patents for given technology that might help partially solve this problem, that's not always the case. And so this is essentially for policymakers to see, for policymakers to solve as a problem. Of course, like the open source community has been working on providing software that is free for everyone to use and not encumbered by patents. But yeah, it's not something that we can solve for existing proprietary software elsewhere. And I'm sure, I was hoping that Jory would jump in to sort of like complement and give additional perspective on this.
Yeah, I was trying to type out a thorough response to Angel's question in the chat, and figured we'd have an opportunity to answer. So, one of the big issues that we have when a open source community wants to implement a FRAND or royalty bearing standard is access, right? First, we need to be able to access the standard in order to implement the standard. And in many cases, we don't have the ability to do that because we are not members. We are not, able to buy into a patent pool or other organizational structure to access the standard. So that's in many cases, as Tobie's pointing out, not an issue of like will or barrier on the open source side, but rather a license incompatibility here that has to be worked out with the organization that owns the proprietary standard. I think we have some examples of places where that has been worked out, but we have to, again, respect the IPR rights of the patent holders who may be, monetizing or contributing and earning from the essential claims that they have. And the open source community has to, of course, respect that their implementation needs to fall within whatever the lines of scope of that standard are as well. So it's tricky. It's not something that is easily facilitated, but something I think many of our communities are keen to do, and requires a strategic decision on the part of the standards organization, and also some maturity of process on the part of the open source community.
Okay, yeah, thank you for your views, which I also, being not really an insider of the open source world, completely endorse. I think that's not really possible. Maybe the other question again from Angel Martin about are there plans to harmonize the KPIs of open source projects, or even create a standards cartography to make decisions from communities and developers easier? Do you have a view on this question?
Do you want to start, Jory?
Yeah, go ahead.
So I'm thinking, I'm making sure I understand the question. First and foremost, okay, all right. So we're talking about metrics and performance. So, okay, sure. Within the Linux Foundation, one tool that we have rolled out to all of our projects is a tool called Insights. And this is something that's still, I think, in active development. We're improving upon it every day. All of our open source projects get hooked into Insights, and we are gathering data not just about what's happening on GitHub, so commits and pull requests and all that kind of activity, but also if that community is on the LF platform, how active are their mailing lists, how active are their Slacks, how active are their meetings, are people coming? And this is sort of giving us a lot more telemetry into the pace of a community, how active it is, how engaged people are, and where in the world they're engaged. That's certainly helping. A lot of that is built on, I think Gerardo has pointed out the chaos project here. There's a lot of great work that has been done by that community, by the to-do group community, by a company called Bitergia, to help everybody kind of align on what those could be. But exactly which KPIs are important for which open source projects is dependent on the project and what the outcome of the project aims to achieve. So that's my answer, Tobie.
Yeah, no, and I think I'd like to add to this that having data from the perspective of an organization deciding to include open source projects into their own products is particularly useful. But what's important to consider is different products have different risk profiles. And with different risk profiles, you're gonna be interested in different kind of data, different kind of information, to ensure that you meet like the requirements, that essentially the requirements that you have identified. So it's a combination of surfacing data that's useful, but also for organizations to better understand how to use that data from their own perspective and the perspectives of the project that they're shipping, of the product that they're shipping. Because quite obviously, depending on whether your software goes into a nuclear power plant or a security camera or a car, or some kind of random a toy or a TV, you're going to have a very different set of constraints and of risks, and you won't be trying to assess the same problems. So there was a lot of work in that space, and also a number of companies who are looking at different kinds of data. But it's also for organizations to educate themselves a little bit better on these topics and better understand their risks.
Okay, thank you, Tobie. There's then another question from Leandro Doctors about funding opportunities, because sometimes these people kind of make the contribution then in their free time. Any ideas to share? And then also maybe here, Carlos, from the Commission perspective, what are your views on that? Jory?
Yeah, so I was just going to add that there's been a lot of work to identify which projects are truly critical, and I'm sure Francisco also has some thoughts on that. Where money has been the need to support those high critical projects, there's been a number of organizations that have popped up to provide opportunities for grant funding. In some cases, that's been just really a smooth process, and I will certainly call out the Sovereign Tech Agency as being just super generous and as easy to work with, and the Alpha Omega folks as well. In other cases, I've had feedback from maintainers that the grant application process for certain funds is more work than just doing the labor of the open source maintenance, and so they're opting out of that. And so that's a place where I would encourage funders to take a look and make sure they're not developing processes which are overly onerous. But then secondarily, sometimes it's not the money, sometimes it's the backstop, right? Like the lottery factor or bus factor, depending on whether you are a positive thinker or a negative thinker, who can help support the person if they need to step away from the project for some period of time, who has keys, and is that person trustworthy? Is that person an entity that can support the project and support their needs, the needs of the infrastructure, the needs of the legal support, etc., in the absence of the core, volunteer maintainer? So many different ways to kind of think about what that volunteer support looks like.
Okay, thank you. I have here a little problem.
I'd love to add to this, but also Carlos showed up on stage, and so maybe he wanted to share some insights.
No, please go ahead, Tobie.
So I think on the question of funding critical infrastructure, which at the end that's really what this is about. First of all, again, Jory mentioned the Sovereign Tech Fund, now Sovereign Tech Agency, which has been an incredible support for the community. And I, in the chat, Astor was mentioning the EU Sovereign Tech Fund, which is there's a report and a lot of really, really good work that has been done very recently to create this report and to suggest that the European Union should set up such a fund for itself to support its critical infrastructure. And I believe that this is something that is absolutely essential for Europe to consider and to move forward with. The second point that I think is really relevant here is that the Cyber Resilience Act does two really interesting things in terms of addressing cybersecurity and open source. And it acknowledges that open source is everywhere and that it's shipping in essentially every device, and that it represents a very large part of the software that is shipped in every device. Depending on how you count, you're looking at anywhere from 75 to 90% of the software that is today running essentially everything is open source. And so the Cyber Resilience Act recognizes this fact, and then recognizes a second very important point, which is that the responsibility for the cyber resilience of that software relies with the manufacturer of the product and not the open source project itself. And so it really puts the responsibility with the organizations that are leveraging open source for their own benefit, and it places a responsibility on them to work upstream with the open source projects in order to make sure that the open source projects that they rely on are secure. And for critical infrastructure and for open source projects that are widely used across Europe, it will probably make sense, also in order to help SMEs, for the European Union to help support these projects, if only from a cyber resilience perspective. So I really kind of like see the Cyber Resilience Act and some form of European sovereign tech fund working hand in hand in order to deliver more secure products in the European Union. Of course, manufacturers will absolutely need to step up and do their work and support the projects that they rely on. But I think there's probably some needs for shared responsibilities here between the European Union and that is driving the Cyber Resilience Act and manufacturers in order to support this better.
Thank you very much. But I don't know, Carlos, you want to jump in to provide a little of the European Commission's perspective?
Yes, maybe a couple of points from my side. I mean, not really providing the, let's say, the official position of the Commission on these things. But yeah, I mean, first that we, from the Commission, we welcome all these initiatives from the community, like this EU Tech Sovereignty Fund. As you know, there is some. I mean, this Commission. The focus of this commission is on investment, competitiveness, tech sovereignty. So we very much welcome initiatives that go in the direction of helping those policy goals. On the CRA, I agree that the CRA is a great example where these things can be applied and this can happen. And of course, with the CRA, you possibly are aware, but the Commission is putting a lot of effort in making sure that these communities are working together. So we have different support actions like CyberStand, or the ESOs have dedicated action grants to make sure that they reach out to the community and they attract this community into the technical committees. So I think the CRA is an excellent example of how the public sector is steering this debate. And then also on a general lines, I think we also welcome let's say bottom-up or spontaneous solutions or arrangements between the open source community and the standardization community. Again, going back to this report from 2019, there were some challenges identified, and some of the recommendations for the ESOs or for the open source community could also be possibly better implemented. So I think we are also counting on both communities to come closer to each other as well. So thank you.
Thank you, Carlos. Okay, there were some other questions.
I'd just like to second the excellent work that the Commission has been doing to involve the open source communities in the implementation and rollout of the CRA. Just wanted that out there because I think they're doing an excellent job, and they're it's worth saying so.
Okay. Yeah. Are there further questions from the audience? Interventions which might be have maybe a more critical view or other problems. We touched IBR's funding issues. A little bit the question, what do you think, what's the way forward? What do you think is open source taking over standardization as a maybe provocative statement?
I don't think so. I wouldn't agree with that statement. I think that what I see, what and maybe I am sometimes guilty of wearing rose-colored glasses, but what I think I see is a lot more recognition of the value that both modalities play. And that's really important, right? Because these are different things. We are source code and something that is executable that we can kind of rapidly change and update and fork and modify and all of that kind of, that's a different thing, a different beast than here's a standard that we don't expect to change that frequently or that drastically, because it's going to help us drive interoperability of information, of data, of safety, of whatever the need is. That's a different beast, and they're playing different roles for us in society. So no, I don't think that one is necessarily going to overcome the other, but I think we're trying to find what the right sort of balance and pace of change and innovation and update really ought to be. As the next step, I think it would be wonderful if our communities worked together to find these examples of where there are these win-win benefits of cooperation and collaboration, and we do our part, I think, to source those at the Linux Foundation, at Linux Foundation Europe, and at the Joint Development Foundation. But it'd be great to be able to point to success stories from across the globe and highlight where that collaboration has enabled more competition, enabled more innovation, helped grow communities and markets, because it's happening. We just need to do, I think, a better job of telling those stories and sharing them. My hot take.
Thank you. Yeah, here now in the chat, there was a question. Okay, any thoughts on community building? Are there mechanisms to get actively people involved? Because what I know from kind of our work in standardization, that we have really a big demographic problem there, which means that there might be even a kind of lower number of contributors. What does maybe, or do the open source community maybe have a better strategy to address this kind of channel challenge to motivate people to get involved? Or do you have no problem in this context?
So yes and no. I mean, every project, like, everyone is fighting for the attention of people, right? There are things that make people want to contribute to your project or your specification or your standard. And they're essentially, how complicated is it to contribute? And how impactful will my contribution be? Right? If you consider these two things, then you can essentially start optimizing for both. The easier it is for someone to show up, make a comment, or suggest an edit, the easier it is to bring people to consider contributing to your project. And the better you treat that comment, the better you consider that input and that voice, the more impactful it's going to make the contribution, and the more chances you have of that contributor coming back to contribute again. And I believe this is particularly important when you're building standards where you want voices of experts who are usually very much thought after, very busy. They will choose where they can have impact. So in between contributing to something where they're going to have to jump through different hoops to even have access to the document, or contributing to something where it can be done in half an hour and they see the result, they will pick the latter in more circumstances than they would pick the former. And so in general, that would be my advice, is make it easy for busy people to have impact. The more you do that, the more contributors you will have.
Okay. Jory, you want to comment on that?
I mean, I do definitely agree with Tobie. We're in an environment where everybody is very busy. It is hard to find time. There's more pressure on people, especially engineers today, to deliver on whatever product it is that they're working on at work, or research if it's a university or whatever. And so the easier you can make it to provide people hooks into what they may be doing for their livelihood, to the project, the better. And I think there's a number of different ways that we've tried to do that within our JDF projects, but it just kind of takes time for folks to understand and develop those patterns as a matter of practice. And but unsurprisingly, I agree with Tobie.
Okay. Yeah, thank you for these views. Unfortunately, our two representatives of the standards communities just sent me emails. They had some urgencies on their sides, therefore they couldn't join. But since we are already getting close to our 90 minutes limit, and I see additional questions here, there's certainly a need to kind of redo this kind of format, and then maybe next time a little more kind of contributions by the standards people. Here also a question about how to deal with the US big techs and the dependencies we have seen in the past and maybe also see in the future. I think that's one other topic. Another one is here open source hardware. I think this might be also a topic for a separate additional webinar. And here also there are activities going on in the standards bodies, and we touched this topic in our report. Carlos mentioned a few times a little bit. It was also a little bit touched in the open source impact study, but I think that's a topic which might be also in the future becoming more relevant. And here I think the collaboration between standardization and open source work has to be even more intensified, because here we probably need further, or we maybe can exploit further synergies which might even go beyond the current we see regarding open source software and standardization. And please have a look at the different links and issues and information in the chat. I want to conclude and thank first all the speakers, and although we kind of lost two, we had, I think, a very nice, very informative and interactive and creative interchange. And here all the comments in the chat are, I think, really calling for another webinar here. Digital sovereignty, also a topic here Mirko Böhm and myself are working on is mentioned. Therefore, I also thank the more than, I think in total we had 60 plus participants, which shows also the still high interest in the topic. And I think there is really, it's a sign for us to redo that. Maybe again in collaboration with then StandICT maybe 29 and the EOSA Awards project. I also thank the co-organizers Astor and Nick from OFE, and in particular my colleagues from Trust IT, which set up the technical infrastructure, which was quite stable, with the exception that I was not heard maybe for a minute, but it doesn't matter. I also included the link to the previous webinar we did, where we had some more slides, and also in the StandICT homepage there is some material to have a look on these topics. If you have questions, please come back to me. I'm always kind of keen to see new trends which we might address in further also research work. Again, many thanks to Jory, Tobie, Carlos and Francesco, and here Anya as the master in the background. Thanks a lot and have a nice afternoon or evening. Thank you.
Thank you very much for having us.
Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.